Well, welcome and thank you for your interest in our online decision support tool. Today in this webinar, we will be providing an overview of a tool that we developed as part of a NIFA-funded project that's meant to help organic growers and potentially even transitioning growers to evaluate ecological weed management strategies to achieve better outcomes on their farm when it comes to the challenge of weed management. What we'll be going through today is first we'll briefly introduce several of us on the research team that were involved in developing this tool. We'll then talk about some of the common ecological weed management strategies or practices that are integrated into the tool. We'll give you a little background on how it was developed and how we used feedback not only from scientists but other stakeholders, including farmers and others involved in agriculture, to build it. And then we will walk through the tool, which you are welcome to jump on it yourself online and follow along that way, but we'll kind of walk through explaining how it works and then have some time at the end for question and answer. So I am Robin Wilson. I am a professor in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University. I'm a behavioral decision scientist, and I was the principal investigator or project director for this project that not only included the development of this resource for organic farmers, but also included a series of field trials looking at the impact of different weed management practices on common goals or objectives that organic farmers may have. And that work was led by Doug Dewin, a professor and state specialist in the Department of Horticulture and Crop Science at Ohio State. He's located at our Worcester campus where we house our Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center. And Doug is a weed scientist and so really provided a lot of the expertise and the contacts on that side of the equation. And then finally we have Doug Bissett, who will be doing most of the talking today. He was a postdoc here at Ohio State at the time that we developed this tool, but he has now moved on and is an assistant professor in the Department of Community Sustainability at Michigan State University. And so I will be handing this off to Doug Dewin in just a minute. But when we were recording this originally, we had a bit of a delay in the recording. So I'm doing a bit of a catch up and intro that will be kind of appended, and Doug will jump in here in a minute. But why are we here? Well, the reason that we wrote the proposal to do this work in the first place is that weed management is one of the biggest challenges for organic growers. It's also a barrier for conventional growers wanting to transition to organic. In fact, there's evidence that weeds and the challenge of managing weeds is the number one reason why some conventional growers say that they wouldn't be interested in transitioning to organic because it becomes much more of a complicated challenge to manage weeds versus having access to chemical herbicides. And so we're hoping to help both organic and conventional growers through this tool. We've invested resources in the study of ecological weed management practices and strategies, but decision support tools like the one that we will present today are really meant to take that science and that understanding and translate it in a meaningful way that will allow farmers to think about what they're currently doing, evaluate things that they could do differently, and consider going forward how they might want to change and adjust their system. So I'm going to hand it off to Doug here, who's going to talk about specific ecological weed management practices. But essentially what an ecological weed management practice is any practice that works to reduce weed seed banks and control emerged weeds, increase biodiversity in the agroecosystem, and reduce the time and labor required to control weeds in the long term. And Doug is going to talk a little bit more about some of these specific strategies.
Using as many natural processes as possible to help to minimize the weed problems that we're experiencing there in the field. This is going to mean that we're going to try to reduce the weed seed bank. We're going to try to have fewer weeds next year than we had this year. This really goes back to the very old adage, maybe ancient adage of 1 year's seeding equals 7 years of weeding, and probably a lot of you are familiar with that. That was certainly something that granddad and great-granddad lived by because they were out roguing the fields to get those weeds that didn't get handled by cultivation so that they would not have to deal with the weeds next year. Another aspect that is so important, there's good evidence to show that it's important, but it's a slow working process, and that's to increase biodiversity in the agroecosystem. You know, more species, more different types of plants, more and different types of insects and microbial organisms, more mice to consume weed seeds that fall on the soil surface in the spring of the year. We want to keep them out there in the field, not in the house. More ground beetles to also consume those weed seeds, just to give you some examples. Bacteria that may attack dormant weed seeds in the soil. And then ultimately, we want to, over time, have to work with over the long term. So let's move on to the next couple of slides. And let me see, I have to do that myself. So what are some practices that you as a farmer can use, ecological weed management practices? Well, first of all, there are those physical approaches to weed control that just about everybody is familiar with and uses every year. Tillage and cultivation and weeding by hand, of course, are kind of the first lines of defense that the farmer is using. In some crops, there is the use of flaming or thermal weed control using heat to kill weeds. For vegetables, the use of mulches, particularly plastic, is permitted by the National Organic Program standards and is very, very helpful. Cover crops are popular, increasingly popular for a number of reasons, but they really can help to minimize and reduce weeds. One thing that is underemphasized often is kind of tackling the weed seed bank. And one of the things that we found in our research over the last 10 years is that a lot of farmers have the belief that weeds are absolutely inevitable. In some cases, they take it back to the Garden of Eden. In other cases, it's just their experience suggests that. But we know from science that that's not quite the case, that in fact, we can have fewer weeds in the future. It all comes down to trying to stimulate those weed seeds to germinate and then killing them before they grow and not letting weeds go to seed, especially late in the summer. So one of the things that we might do is create stale seed beds before planting. This works particularly well if we're doing vegetables, where we can go out and create a relatively shallow layer of soil that we have done some light tillage on a number of times, each time getting more weeds to come up and then killing those. Roguing, we talked about that earlier. And of course, paying careful attention to weed seeds, to the seed quality that we're using on the farm. Are we sure that our crop seed is free of weeds? What about when we purchase compost and use that? You know, sometimes there's soil attached to used equipment that we might buy from some other farm and bring onto our farm. Who knows what is in that soil clinging to the equipment? Then we talked a lot about the use of biodiversity in the agroecosystem. One of the things that you want to do is to minimize the amount of time that you have bare ground. So this is where using cover crops, for instance, comes in. Try to never have an extended period of time where there's not something growing. This helps to encourage microbial life, amongst other things, and it reduces the amount of space where weeds can grow between crops. Crop rotations are hugely important and are often kind of underutilized, sometimes for real practical reasons, like how far the corn fields are from the homestead and from the silos. That's a factor, but nevertheless, we want to realize that crop rotation really can make a difference. More complex and longer rotations generally tend to reduce problems with weeds. Forage crops, we know if we get a forage crop in there, it's going to break that weed seed cycle and will reduce the amount of annuals that we have. On the other hand, if we've got a real problem with perennial weeds, having a lot of tillage and a lot of cultivation on an ongoing basis for a few years can help to reduce those. And we also talked a lot about the importance of that biodiversity in terms of the soil organisms and particularly the microorganisms that grow there and the beneficial effect that they can have, one, on the crop, and secondly, at reducing the persistence of weed seeds in the soil. So we'll move on to the last slide that I'm going to be talking about this morning and finishing up on ecological weed management. Um, what are we really trying to accomplish by ecological weed management? We want to increase the crop's ability to compete with the weeds. That's really what it all comes down to, is competitiveness. So establishing and maintaining dense crop stands. This is the most important thing that you can do. And we've all talked to farmers who have had to abandon a field or abandon a planting and reseed because it didn't get off to a good start. Things you can do would be to increase the seeding rate, decrease row spacing, etc. Remember that small weeds are easy to control and big weeds are hard to control. So we encourage people to do their cultivation when weeds are at the white thread stage, which is just before they emerge. Just a few, 15, 20 minutes of a drying wind can kill those tiny seedlings. Consider using a cover crop between rows. That's going to work in some situations, not in all. And above all, keep in mind that old adage again, that 1 year of seeding is 7 years of weeding. Anything that you can do to reduce weed seeds from going back to the seed bank is going to pay dividends to you, potentially for years to come.
Great. So thanks, Doug. So my name is also Doug, and I'm going to take over from now. So Doug talked a lot about what we call ecological weed management practices, and I'm going to talk a bit about what we think of when we talk about an ecological weed management strategy. So in the way we look at this, an ecological weed management strategy is an integrated, purposeful combination of practices. So it's not unlikely that you are using a number of practices on your farm. But when we talk about a strategy, we mean a strategy that relies on a bit more explicit characterization and analysis of how those practices are working together. So we're thinking about more of a systems focus and thinking about how those practices, pros and cons, their cost and benefits, and how they work together. So developing a more comprehensive strategy or system of practices, not just thinking about the practices themselves. So that's kind of the first element. The second element is really trying to make sure that that strategy, that group of practices, achieves the farmer's most important on-farm objectives. And again, when we talk about this, we're talking about a much more explicit and a more specific characterization of what we're trying to achieve on the farm. And then finally, we're thinking about incorporating the science the best available science that we have to match those practices with what's most important to us. So what's important to realize here is that we all have different priorities. So Doug just talked a lot about the different priorities that we might have on the farm, but we likely all prioritize them differently. We all care about soil health. We care about the extent of our weed seed bank, the labor and costs that go into weeding, but we prioritize those things differently. So developing an EWM strategy or an ecological weed management strategy is really identifying that set of practices that's going to achieve your objectives best. So that's what we mean by an EWM strategy. So that's great, you might be thinking, but that's really difficult to do, right? It's difficult to think about how all of these practices come together. So not only is it tricky to design a strategy that incorporates all of those practices, but it's also really tricky to evaluate how well that group of practices is working, especially thinking about how a different set of practices might work on your farm. You don't have multiple farms that you can do trials with different sets of strategies. So that's hopefully something that we can do with the tool or with this website that I'm about to present here in a couple of slides, where we can help you to evaluate a set of practices or a strategy without necessarily having to try it on different farms. So we know that designing and evaluating the practices is tough. The other thing that we know is that we haven't always helped. So researchers, scientists at universities, we've spent a lot of time focusing on our outreach on the risks of different strategies and trying different practices on the farm. And we haven't spent as much time talking about the benefits of different strategies. And one of the things we know from decision science is that the more you talk about the risks, the more you're going to discourage people from trying new things. Whereas if we talk about the benefits of things, you can actually encourage adoption of new strategies that might work better on people's farms. So designing and evaluating the practices is tough. Combining them is tough. We haven't always done a great job as university researchers. And then finally, there's a misunderstanding of how different strategies might help farmers meet their on-farm objectives. So we might be able to develop a strategy, but it's unclear how well that strategy is going to help specific farmers who have different objectives. So that's another thing that we're trying to do with the tool. And that's where this thing that we're calling the organic weed manager comes in. So we actually used to call it the organic weed management tool, but we found that as we would go out to people's farms and talk about the tool with them, they were expecting us to arrive with an actual implement. And then when I got there with my little computer, they were disappointed. So we changed the name of it from the organic weed management tool to just the organic weed manager. And hopefully that's a bit more clear. So really, what is the organic weed manager? So really, it's an easy to use online decision support tool. What we mean by decision support tool is simply anything that can help somebody make a better decision. We want to help organic growers build their own ecological weed management strategy. And the way we've done that is to integrate a lot of science. So we've incorporated a lot of weed scientists, soil scientists, and decision scientists, as well as input from you all. So I'm sure there are people on the call that have sat down perhaps with me personally and helped kind of identify what should go into the website and how the website is working. So taking all of that information together, we want to do three things. So we want to help farmers identify their current weed management practices and performance. And again, that's something that we're going to be a little bit more explicit on. So it's certain that you all have thought about what practices you use. I'm sure if I asked you, you could identify the practices you're using on your farm. And if I asked you how well they're performing, I'm sure you could say. But what we really want to do is be very explicit about identifying what your current practices are, how well those practices are performing, so that we can then identify new practices that might perform better. And then we want to help farmers characterize their most important on-farm objectives. So this is something that, again, we tend to think about the different options available to us, but we don't perhaps spend a lot of time thinking about what we're trying to achieve with our objectives. And so the tool helps you to do that as well. And then finally, we want to evaluate different strategies and their performance across those objectives that are most important to you. So not just identify strategies that perform well in the abstract, but identify strategies that really perform well according to what's most important to you. And that's really what the organic weed manager, I think, does really well. So there's kind of 5 broad things that the tool focuses on. And don't worry, we are going to get to the tool here pretty soon, but I just want to do a little bit more background. So first, the tool is going to focus on characterizing the benefits of strategies rather than the risks. So I talked about that a little bit earlier. We want to engage both the short and long-term trade-offs of different strategies. And this is something that the tool spends a lot of time on, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about. We tend not, and this isn't something that just farmers think about, but this is just human beings in general. We tend to just think about the short term, what's right in front of us. And that might come at the cost of long-term better performance if we can think about the long term. So the tool presents both short-term trade-offs and long-term trade-offs, and the benefits and costs of doing things in the short term versus the long term. We also want to make those trade-offs more explicit, and that'll become more clear when we actually get into the tool. And then we want to connect different strategies to growers' most important objectives. And this, again, this is really important here, is not just identifying which strategies perform best in the abstract, but identifying those strategies that perform best according to what's most important to you as an organic farmer. And then finally, and this, what's really neat about this last point is this isn't something that we originally had identified. And then we did a number of interviews with organic growers, and they identified, oh, you know what we really need? We need like a roadmap. We need some kind of document that helps identify what we're currently doing and what we need to start doing and stop doing to incorporate one of these strategies. So the tool provides this incremental and practical pathway at the end of the tool to help farmers identify what they need to do differently. I just wanted to make sure that you all knew that your input was and remains critical. So this is a tool that we've been spending a lot of time on over the last 5 years. We've sat down with a number of organic growers from Ohio and outside the state to help identify what needs to go into the tool and to evaluate how well it works. Again, we've spent over 5 years. We've relied on a lot of scientists. So a lot of soil, weed, decision scientists have contributed to the project. Back in 2014, we conducted 23 interviews with organic growers to identify what the common practices and objectives we should incorporate into the tool are. We then conducted 16 expert interviews to help group those particular practices that Doug talked about earlier in the webinar into specific strategies. So what would be the practices that make up these different types of strategies? We then conducted 11 interviews in 2016 with organic growers, and those growers actually sat down and worked through the tool and the current website and made recommendations about ways we could say things differently, ways we could present information differently, and we tried to incorporate all of their recommendations as best as we could. And then finally, last year, this was really exciting. We actually deployed the website online. And we had 45 organic growers from across the country work through the tool and evaluate it. And what we found is that people really liked it. So we got really positive evaluations from most of the people that worked through the tool. They liked the different tasks that the tool had. It helped them characterize both what they're doing on their farm and how well it's performing. And it helped them to think about weeds and weed management differently. So even if they weren't necessarily going to change their behavior, just having a different way of thinking about how they make those decisions was really important to them. And they really liked working through the tool. So hopefully you all feel the same way. There's of course these dense academic articles that I'm happy to share with people if they'd like. But I won't right now. So, all right, so let's move to the actual tool. So this is going to be tricky for some of you. I have 3 computer screens in front of me, so it's a little bit easier for me. But if you'd like to follow along and work through the tool on your own, you can certainly do that. So if you want to go to organicweedmanager.com right now, you can do that. It might be a bit tricky, so if it seems complex and like something you don't necessarily want to do right now, you can just follow me. I'm going to work through the tool. It might actually work better for you to just follow along with me, and then at the end of the webinar you can go on the tool. You'll see that it's pretty easy to work with, so you won't have to necessarily take notes or anything. And then, as Robin said, sorry, I am not paying attention to chat questions, so hopefully Robin will interrupt me if there's something that I need to do or respond to.
I am paying attention. There's just been a question about making the PowerPoint, and I did get the video or the recording to start a little late. I had to log out and log back in, but we will make those available. And at the end, I'll highlight where some of those resources are and where we will make the resources from today available as well.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so I am going to bring my screen over here, and hopefully you can all see this and see how well I can make this happen. So is everybody seeing Organic Weed Manager? Robin, are you seeing it?
Yes, we are seeing it.
Okay, so hopefully, again, I want to provide the opportunity for if you want to follow this along and work through the tool on your own, you can. But again, you don't need to. You can just follow along with me, and then you can go to the website afterwards. And it's probably simpler if you want to do that going forward. Okay, so I'm just going to assume everybody has gotten to where they want to be, and I'm going to start. So this is the landing page for Organic Weed Manager. This page provides quite a bit of information about the tool and what is involved in it. I want to point out a couple things here. So first, it's going to identify the 4 things that the tool does. So it's going to help you identify what you currently do on your farm. It's going to identify what characteristics you care about most. It's going to help you compare your strategy, what you're currently doing on your farm, against other weed management strategies. And then at the end, it's going to provide a recommendation or identify a strategy that may help you better achieve your goals as a farmer. It may not. It may identify that what you're doing on your farm is exactly what you should be doing. And that hopefully that's the case. But it might also provide a strategy that might work better. You can see that it takes about 20 minutes to complete. I've worked through this a couple times on my own, and it takes about 20 minutes, but I might move a little bit quicker through the tool here just because I'm going to explain some of its features and why we did what we did. So it may not necessarily take 20 minutes. There's also additional farming resources that are provided by OSU. So if you click on here on that button, you can get a bunch of really valuable resources that Ohio State offers as well. And then I wanted to make one last plug. So this website was designed for Google Chrome. You can use it on any browser. I primarily work in Firefox, and I've never really had any problems with it. But we developed it for Chrome. So if you want all the bells and whistles to work perfectly, then maybe download Google Chrome. It's free, and run through the tool on that. But again, you don't have to. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So the tool starts by just explaining it's a very short tutorial about how things work, about how we navigate through it. Again, I'm going to move relatively quickly through this stuff. I do want to point out that at the top of the screen, there's a navigation bar, and this is just going to provide you some kind of a roadmap of where you're at in the tool, what you've already accomplished, and what you still have to do. So you can see that there are primarily 3 steps. Step 1, what you do. Step 2, how well it works. And step 3, what you care about. And the tool allows you to move between these pretty effortlessly, which is really neat. You can also use the previous and next buttons to move around. So again, you can see what you've accomplished is in this light green color. And perhaps some of you have already worked through this tool and you've already played with it. And you can see that some of the colors may have changed over time, but this is the current iteration. So you can see these light green colors mean these are steps that you've already accomplished. You're currently on this dark green step, and anything in light gray is what you still have to do. But again, you can move through pages pretty easily. So I've already spoken about this. There's navigation buttons. This is pretty intuitive. So on the left side of the screen, this is something that we call a guidance panel. So this is going to provide helpful information throughout your experience with the tool. So anytime you need to do something that we think you might need a little bit more information about, this guidance panel is going to pop up. You can also click for guidance whenever you need to. So maybe there's something that doesn't make sense. You can always click to get a guidance panel to come up. The guidance panel is actually the guidance panel button is in the lower left-hand part of the screen. It's not here now, but it'll show up once we start working through the tool. There's 3 questions that the Weed Manager asks before you get started with the actual modules. I just want to say briefly that it doesn't matter what you answer on these questions, you still can play with the tool. So even if you don't operate a farm and you click no, you can still work your way through the tool. I'm going to click yes, just so we can see what the other questions are. It's going to ask us if your farm is certified organic. Again, you can say yes or no, it doesn't matter. You can still work through the tool, but I'm going to click yes. And then finally, this is an important question. Would you like your responses to be included in future efforts to improve the website and its recommendations? So we are constantly improving the tool. We want to incorporate the data that you provide to help improve our recommendations and to help us improve how the tool works into the future. So if you'd like your responses to be included, please click yes. If you don't want us to evaluate or collect your data, that's totally okay as well. And you can just click no, and we won't have your data going forward. So yeah, so that's all I'll say about that. I'm going to click no because we don't want this data that I'm about to use. All right, so let's get started. So the first step, this is identifying what you currently do on your farm. So not what you want to do, not how well it's performing. Really, the first step is just to identify what you do. So you've got the guidance panel. It's going to provide some information about this step. For the sake of time, I'm just going to click OK and get to what the actual tool is here. But if you wanted to go back to the guidance panel, you would just come down here and click for guidance, and the panel would come back up. So you can see that we've got 6 characteristics here. The first characteristic is a soil type. So what the tool asks you to do is to just select whichever soil type best represents your farm. We recognize that you might have multiple soil types on your farm. Sorry, I'm looking at a question, but I shouldn't look at the chat function because it'll distract me. Robin will stop me when necessary. So the soil type, again, we spoke to farmers. We know that some people believe they have multiple soil types on their farm, but we just want you to pick the soil type that best represents your farm. So for this, I'm going to click sandy loam. Next, we want you to identify 1 or more crop rotation techniques. So again, you might want to spend a little bit more time than I'm going to here looking through these crop rotations and really spending some time identifying what you do. For the sake of time, I'm just going to select 2, but you could select as many as you like for that. Next, we're going to ask you to identify cover crops. If you don't use cover crops, you can just select that you don't. I'm going to select no. Again, I just want to reiterate that it would probably take more time for you to look through these, but I'm moving quickly. There are 6 cultivation techniques. You can select whichever cultivation techniques you rely on your farm. I'm going to click 2. And then provide a tillage as well. So maybe you're using inversion tillage once, maybe you're using inversion tillage subsoiling every 3 years, or no-till. Just select 1 or more of those methods. And then finally, there's a nutrient management option, and you're just going to select between spoon feed or broadcast feed fertilizer. And I want to say, with regard to these farming practices, we've spent a lot of time sitting down with organic farmers and asking them both how to characterize these practices and which practices to include. So hopefully these all make sense to you. If there are certain things that don't make sense, please bring it to our attention, and we'll try to either address that moving forward. But hopefully these all make sense. Okay, so once you've identified what your farming practices are, again, I'm going to move quickly through this and not necessarily read this guidance panel, but if you'd like to come back to this, you always can. So everything you just selected, we're just taking that information from the last page and moving it to this page. So here you can review your strategy. If there's something wrong and you want to change it, you can just go back to that last page and reselect it. So next, we're going to start comparing strategies. So now we're going to compare what you're doing on your farm, what we're calling your strategy, versus the common strategy. And the common strategy is those practices that were most often identified by organic farmers in our past research. So we did a lot of interviews, and we asked organic farmers to identify the practices they use most often, and these are those practices. So you can look at what you're doing on your farm and identify how it compares to what other organic farmers are most commonly doing. So hopefully that's a helpful process. So next, we're going to introduce one of our, what we're kind of calling our canned weed management strategies. This is a slightly more aggressive strategy focused on destroying weeds early and often during the critical stage, or what is commonly called the white thread stage. So if this is the type of strategy that you might be interested in, you can look and see how your strategy compares against the practices that make up this strategy. Next, we're going to present an even more aggressive weed management strategy. So this is called the seed bank elimination strategy. In this strategy, organic farmers are going to spend more energy ridding their fields of weeds early on, so in the short term, years 1 through 4. And then what we expect is that farmers are going to reap the benefits later on, so 5 years later or 4 years later to be exact in the long term. So with regard to this strategy, we've actually separated it into 2 columns. So you can see the practices that make up the years 1 through 4, and then the practices that you would then continue to rely on in years 5+. But you can see that some of those practices you'll no longer need to pursue in the long term. So that's just comparing your strategy and that strategy. On the final page here, you can look at how all of the practices that make up each strategy are compared. So this is something we call a holistic evaluation, and you can see what you're doing compared to what the common strategy is, what the common strategy compared to the critical stage weed management strategy is, etc. Now notice we're not talking about performance here. We're not getting into how well these strategies are performing yet. These are you're just looking at the practices that comprise them, okay? So the next step is identifying how well the practices that you're currently relying on your farm work. So again, I'm going to move through this guidance panel, but you can always come back here and click on it if you want more information. So again, how well do your current farming practices work for you? So we've got these 6 characteristics. So some of them might be more intuitive than others. So with regard to soil organic matter, you're simply going to look at soil organic matter and select either 1 to 2%, 2 to 3%, etc. So hopefully this is pretty straightforward. I'm going to go ahead and click 2 to 3%. And then the next 3, so these are all soil health characteristics. We have water infiltration, biological health, and the extent of your weed seed bank. To see more specific information about what we mean there, you can actually hover over the eye, the little icon that's next to the topic there, and you'll get a definition, and this helps identify what we mean by the different selections that you can make. So with regard to water infiltration, there's slowly, moderately, or rapidly, and you can look at these different definition tabs and see what we mean by that. Again, for the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of move quickly through here and say that my water infiltration is, it's not great. We'll just put slowly. For biological health, again, you can bring up the definition and see more specifically what the options are here. For biological health, I'm going to say that mine's moderate. And then with regard to a weed seed bank, we actually have photos there, so you can see what we mean by a low seed bank, moderate seed bank, and a high seed bank. I'm going to go ahead and select that I have a high seed bank. With regard to time spent weeding, what we mean there is during the growing season, the proportion of time you spend weeding out of all of your farm chores. So we've got a couple different selections here. Again, this would probably take a little bit more time thinking about how much time you spend weeding. I know I'm moving quickly through this, but you can always come back and spend a little bit more time. So I'm going to say that I spend about 11 to 20% of my time weeding. Finally, annual costs. This is your annual mechanical and manual weeding costs per acre. If you look at the selection, the different categories you can select, if you're spending $500 a year or less per acre, you would select low. 500 to 2,000 a year, medium, 2,000 or more, high. So I'm going to select medium for my costs. So now I've identified how well my current farming practices are working on my farm. So once I've done that, so we're going to review those strategies just like we did for the practices. So here are the characteristics. These are how well my current strategy is performing. And on the next page, we're going to start to see be able to compare characteristics. So how well my strategy is performing on my farm compared to what we would expect to see with those other strategies. So I'm going to move past this guidance panel. And so here again, you have your strategy identified here. And what's cool about this page is you can hover over a particular strategy and see how well that strategy performs across each characteristic compared to your strategy. So with regard to common strategy, you can see that it's performing slightly better with regard to soil organic matter and water infiltration. It's performing about the same with regard to biological health and weed seed bank, and it's performing better with time spent weeding or costs. So my strategy is not working well. That shouldn't be a huge surprise since I'm not an organic farmer. It's not a surprise my strategy is performing poorly. But then you can look at the other strategies and see how well they perform, again, compared to how your strategy is performing. So you would hover over seed bank elimination, and you can see how that performs from years 1 through 4. And then you can also see how it performs in years 5+. And you can see that everything's green here. So this strategy is working much better than my strategy is performing. So that should be alarming to me if I was a farmer and I saw this. I'd be like, oh, wow, I'm really not doing a good job. There are other strategies out there that might perform a lot better. So that's what this page provides. On the next page, this is providing kind of all of the information at once. So as opposed to just comparing one strategy and another, this provides a comparison of all 4 strategies at the same time. And the legend over here on the right side of the screen identifies what the best performing characteristic and the worst. So if we look at my strategy, my water infiltration is performing slowly. That's the worst. That's the worst performance the worst performance across the different strategies. Same thing with regard to my high weed seed bank. That's performing really poorly. If we look at the best, we can see that, oh, over here, seed bank elimination strategy in years 5+, we're seeing a lot of the best characteristics over here. So that might be a strategy I want to consider going forward. So the next opportunity or the next task in the tool is to have you rank the strategies. So this is pretty straightforward. This is how we make decisions in our typical day. And this is a pretty neat thing that the coders and website developers were pretty excited about. You can actually pick up, so you would just click on each strategy and you can drag them to where you prefer them. So this is just asking you to look at the performance. We're not looking at practices here. We're just looking at how well each strategy performs, and you can rank them according to which one you prefer most and which one you prefer least. So here I would say, well, I'm going to prefer the common strategy most, and I like the seed bank elimination strategy. Critical stage weed management is better than my strategy. Clearly my strategy is the worst, so I'm going to prefer that least. So once you've ranked your strategy, then we're going to move on to the next step. So this is where we really get into what's most important to you. So we've talked a lot about practices. We've talked a lot about how well they're performing on your farm. Here we want to delve down or dig a little bit deeper into what's most important to you. So I'm going to move past this guidance panel, but of course, remember that you can always come back to that. And I'm going to talk about this page here. So this is something that we call swing weighting. And what's different about this type of ranking. So in a typical decision process, you might just rank what's most important to you. So we have these 6 characteristics. We're going to rank them in order of what's most important. So maybe if I just asked you in the abstract, what is the most important characteristic of these 6, you might say, well, soil organic matter is really important to me. I want to make sure that I rank that first. And if I asked you, well, how's soil organic matter important, or what's the importance of soil organic matter compared to water infiltration? And you might say like, oh, well, soil organic matter is more important to me than water infiltration. But what's unique about this step is that we actually want you to focus on the difference between the worst outcome and the best outcome. So it might be that soil organic matter is really important to you, but what if the difference between the worst outcome and the best outcome isn't that big of a difference for you? You're completely happy with your soil organic matter being 2 to 2.5%. It doesn't matter to you that you want it to be, or that it would be 3 to 3.5%. You're fine with it being 2 or 2.5%. So what that would mean is that this isn't really that important to you. Again, it's not that soil organic matter isn't important to you. It's just that the difference between the worst and the best outcome, that's not a big difference. You're fine with it, whichever one it is. Whereas with water infiltration, you really want that moderate to rapid water infiltration, whereas slow is kind of your worst nightmare. So that's really important to you. And then what we'd like you to do is do that process with all 6 of these characteristics. So same thing with biological health. Maybe biological health in the abstract is very important to you, but it's not so important to you that you have poor or good. Poor biological health is fine. So we're going to put that down here near the bottom. And then you're going to do that with all 6 characteristics. So let's say water infiltration, moving that from slow to moderate or rapid is really important to you. Same thing with weed seed bank. It's really important for you to move from the worst to the best outcome. You don't want a high weed seed bank. You want a low weed seed bank. Maybe it's more important to you than water infiltration. So we're going to move that to the top. And then what we're going to do is do the same thing. here. Time spent weeding. Again, maybe it's not super important to you that you spend 40% of your time weeding. Maybe that's fine. Maybe you like to be out in the fields weeding, so you're going to have that somewhat low. I get that down here. And then finally, weeding costs, let's put that in the middle. So what we've done here is we've had you identify your most important characteristics and objectives on your farm, but it's not this abstract, like, oh, well, these things are just terms. We're really basing this in the reality of how these strategies might perform on your farm. So once you've done that, we're going to provide one more opportunity for you to adjust these prioritizations. And again, I'm going to move past this guidance panel. So here, we're providing an opportunity for you to adjust the relative importance of them a bit more. So this takes the information from the last page. You put weed seed bank as top, water infiltration second, weeding costs third, etc. But maybe weed seed bank is really, really important to you. You really want to move it from high to low. So that's really important. Water infiltration, that's pretty important, but not nearly as important as weed seed bank. And maybe these other four you just don't care about. Like, yeah, they're important, but I don't even think about them when I'm on the farm. Doesn't matter to me. These two are really important. So you can see that most of the weight now is going to be attributed to weed seed bank, or reducing your weed seed bank and improving your water infiltration. Or maybe you care about them, slightly more equally. So they're all important. So you're gonna, but the relative order of them is the same. But you care, you even care about soil organic matter, even though it's down here at the bottom. So this might be a more appropriate prioritization of these characteristics for you. So once you're done with that and you feel happy with that, you're going to go ahead and click next, and that's going to lock those in. And now this is where the tool is going to start making recommendations. So the first thing we're going to do is remind you of how you ranked the strategies in step 3. So way back in step 3, when we asked you, what do you like? And you ranked those strategies. We're going to just remind you here. So actually, if we go back here to the what do you like, we can actually see how you ranked them. So here, common strategy was first, your strategy was least. So we're going to go back. So that's how you ranked them in the previous step. We're going to go back to where we were in the tool. This is simply replicating what we showed there, but in a slightly different way of showing this information. So again, rank 1, that was your common strategy. That was what you ranked highest. Seed bank elimination was next, critical stage weed management third, and your strategy fourth. So again, that was a lot of words to just describe something that you already did. Okay, so once you've reminded yourself of how you ranked them, next we're going to show you so we're going to compare how you ranked the different strategies directly against how they perform based on how important you said each characteristic was to you. So that's might be confusing. So let me try to explain that better. So again, on the left side of the screen, this is how you ranked those strategies directly. In the middle of the screen, or on the right side of the screen, now what we're showing you is how each of those strategies perform with respect to what's most important to you. So here we have seed bank elimination, that's getting 100 points. We're saying that seed bank elimination performs best with respect to what I identified as most important to me. So maybe it doesn't perform well with regard to those characteristics that aren't important to me. So if I said that soil organic matter is not important to me, maybe seed bank elimination doesn't perform great with respect to that objective because it's not important to me. So really what this is showing you is which strategy is going to perform best with what's most important to you. So it should identify what the best strategy is for you and what you care about on your farm. So that's a really neat function of this tool. So once we provided these, your original rankings and what the tool is going to suggest is most performs best, then we're going to ask you which one you want to select. So you might not want to change. So let's say you ranked common strategy as highest. You look over here, you see that common strategy still performs relatively well. It's not as good as seed bank elimination, but maybe there's something involved with seed bank elimination that you're just not willing to do, but you like the common strategy, so you're going to select that. Okay. So you can pick whichever one you want. For now, let's say that you're willing to change. You liked the common strategy before, but now you want to do seed bank elimination. You're going to select seed bank elimination. And on the next page, this is, I think, the most important function of the whole tool. This is the summary of the practices that you need to continue, start, and stop if you want to transition your farm from the strategy that you're currently using to your new preferred strategy. So again, I'm going to close out of here. So this isn't the moving from the strategy that you ranked highest. This is moving from the strategy that you're currently using. And maybe it's not a strategy at all. Maybe it's just a collection of practices that you use, and you're behind the gun and you're just doing the best you can. And these are the practices that you're identifying. This page provides information for you to move from that current strategy, what you're doing today, to the seed bank elimination strategy, or whichever strategy the tool predicted would perform best for you. And again, perform best for you across what's most important to you. So if you look at this third column over here, you can see that these are the practices that I would need to continue in blue, start in green, and stop in red to transition to this new strategy. And if you want to save this, you can come down here and click save, and it's probably going to pop up on another page. But it'll provide a PDF that you can then print, and you could either take that and enact those practices on your farm, or maybe you could talk to an extension agent if you have questions about how you might do that, or whatever you want to do with that information. It's up to you, basically. So let's say you're happy with this, you've printed off your page, you click next, you are now finished, you have completed the organic weed manager. You of course can move throughout the tool however you'd like. If you want to click on any one of these windows, you can go back and play with things or move stuff around. There's also that additional farming resources if you click here. And then if you want to complain about the tool, make sure that you contact Robin. Don't contact me, but contact Robin, email her. You can also contact our coder and web developer, Christian Beaudry. But the quickest reaction you'll probably get is if you email Robin. So that's where we're at. I'm going to stop there and go back to the slides and go here. So I think so that took a little bit longer than I wanted, but we still have 10 minutes for questions.
We do, thank you. And I have been keeping an eye on the chat and kind of responding as we go. We did have 2 questions come in, but certainly feel free to type something in now or unmute yourself and jump in if you have a burning question. I have a couple of minutes of wrap up, but we certainly have time for a couple questions. There was a question about making the PowerPoint available. On our final slide, we list some of those resources that Doug highlighted that are also linked through the tool. We list where we have those available through the OSU websites. That is where we will include a PDF of the PowerPoint for those interested. And then also the recording, I was able to get that recorded. I had to kind of log out and log in to let it recognize me. So I might have to append a little intro to it, but missed a little bit of the beginning. But we will make that available as well. So you can always share that with others or go back and listen. And then Katrina had asked a question about those kind of filtering questions at the beginning that said, do you operate a farm? And then if yes, is it certified organic? And are you willing to let us use the data? She just asked kind of, why did you ask about the owning a farm first? And really that's because we're happy with anyone using this tool or playing around with it. We imagine it has some pretty good educational value, even for maybe, professors at a university working with students and so we want to be able to differentiate if people are entering data into it, what data actually reflects real decisions on a farm versus which doesn't. And for those that are entering data about a real farm somewhere, we want to make sure they're okay with us using that to kind of learn about how effective different strategies are relative to the sorts of things that we know organic farmers care about. So those are just kind of questions to help us, I guess, understand the quality of the data that might come in if we were to go back and try to use that to improve the tool.
Robin, there's another really kind of practical weed control reason for that question as well, in that recognizing that the sort of seed bank management strategy requires a higher investment for the farmer. Sometimes a farmer would be more willing to do that if they own their own land, if they own the farm, compared to someone who's renting it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. We did have a couple questions come in. Lisa asked, and this might be a question for Doug Doohan, can you talk about the difference between cultivate at white thread stage and cultivate once or twice when weather allows? Clearly, weather is always a factor in when one can cultivate.
I think in many ways, Robin has largely answered that question. If you think of this past year, you were lucky to cultivate at all. At least in Ohio, and I think in most of the other Corn Belt states, it was just a terrible year to get anything done. But we know that the kill rate on the weeds is just much, much, much higher if you can cultivate at the white thread stage or very soon beyond that, when weeds are just barely emerging out of the ground. By the time weeds get about 2 inches high, they're really hard to control without really aggressive cultivation, which is almost certainly, because it's more aggressive, going to damage your crop as well, and the efficacy is going to be way down. So hopefully that explains why cultivating at the white thread stage is so important. If you can possibly work that in.
Yeah, if you can do it, right? And that is the increasingly big question, I think, for not just organic systems, obviously, but in agriculture in general, with the weather challenges that are becoming more and more common. We also had a question, what about farms who are in transition to organic? So saying that some of the current farming practices on these types of operations are not represented in the tool. I guess I'll take a stab at answering that, and there's really two parts maybe to my answer. One is we hope that this could also be useful for transitioning farmers. I'm not sure if Doug mentioned this earlier in the kind of intro and background, but one of the reasons we pursued this is that the kind of number one reason that conventional farmers give about not wanting to transition to organic is weeds. So a concern about having to move away from like chemically based herbicides and having to take on an even bigger challenge to manage weeds. And so we are very interested in helping transitioning farmers or even conventional farmers think that through. That being said, we did kind of gear it more towards organic systems. So if you have specific feedback on practices that aren't represented that you think might be useful in kind of future iterations of this, we would love to hear that. That's the sort of thing that we hope as people use this and as more people with different backgrounds and different interests use it, we get feedback that allows us to continue to improve it moving forward, or even think about you know, whether or not we need multiple versions that are kind of tailored more towards different kind of baselines or starting practices in different systems. I don't know if either of the Dougs want to weigh in on that.
Well, I guess that I would answer the question with a question. Gorman Heritage Farm, you mentioned that you use other farming practices. Could you give some indication of what your practices you're referring to?
And you can, you know, follow up with us after too if you want, or feel free to type them in.
Yeah.
But thank you for that.
Yeah, I would just add that I think Robin covered this, but I think one of the neat things about this tool, and again, Robin just said this, but is that it collects the data that you or that people that are interacting with the tool provide, and then we incorporate that into the underlying model behind the tool that's kind of making those recommendations. So the more people that use the tool and the more recommendations we get and the more field trials that we can then inform based on that information, the better the tool's recommendations will be over time. And if there are practices that aren't represented currently, but a lot of people identify them as being necessary in the tool, we can incorporate those practices later. So the tool kind of educates itself and should get better over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually a good transition. I want to respect everyone's time. So Doug, if you want to move forward to the next slide, and we'll kind of keep an eye. Oh, we got a response from Gorman Heritage Farm, chemical application, disking, and no cultivation. So yeah, so we, you know, specifically didn't focus on chemical application because of the interest in kind of ecological weed management and not being able to use that. So that is a really good question. I think something we can kind of think about as far as that transitioning system and how we could help people think through what that transition might look like. So we have, and there was that link on the landing page of Organic Weed Manager, but we, if you go to go.osu.edu, Eco Weed Management, so there in the big letters at the top of the screen, you'll find a curated list of resources, including online fact sheets, tools, additional webinars, case studies on ecological weed management. That is where we will post a PDF of this PowerPoint and also the recording. Where what we highlight there is a whole suite of things we think are useful, including some of the other things we've highlighted here. So the SARE publication, Steel in the Field, is a comprehensive look at cultivation tools, cover crops, and rotations for weed management. You can download it for free from SARE or purchase it as a hard copy for a small fee. eOrganic is another really great resource from across the country, so including kind of resources tailored to different states and regions. Including several fact sheets on ecological weed management for organic vegetable growers. So that's another good kind of specific resource we wanted to call out. And then Penn State also has an excellent online guide to creating a weed management plan for your organic farm. And your state extension service, I know a lot of folks on the call are probably from Ohio, but we may have others as well. Your state service may offer additional resources, and we are from this project actually finishing up 2 new fact sheets from Ohio State that will be available on our website in the coming months. And so definitely use that as a resource moving forward. And so kind of in line with what this is really the last slide, but in line with what we said, we see this as a living tool, a living project. So the original funding for this project has ended, and that was through USDA. That supported the engagement with farmers and other stakeholders, the development of this tool. It supported field trials that Doug Dewan and his team were responsible for, trying to better understand these relationships between different weed management practices and impacts on soil health and other indicators that farmers are interested in. As many of you probably know, there's still a lot of open questions about how these things interact and what that means for achieving on-farm goals, especially in organic systems, where there's this high level of complexity and balance that has to be achieved. So we're hoping that as people use this, we'll get feedback like we've gotten from some of you today on things we could think about or maybe integrate in future versions. Like Doug Bassett pointed out, as you enter data saying, I'm doing this and these are the sorts of results I'm getting on my farm, that actually is a really interesting source of data looking at effectiveness and might really actually help us fill some of these gaps that we haven't filled yet with field trials or other kind of science that's out there. I know Doug Dewan and some of the soil scientists we work with are very interested in continuing this line of research through field trials to test the different recommendations of the tool and better understand how combinations of practices might play out. And we, of course, want to continue to hear from you. So please share this with others. Like we said, we hope that this is something that individual farmers can use as a resource and a way to kind of think through what they're doing. We hope that it, you know, if you work in extension or in other sorts of outreach and engagement positions, that this is something that you might find useful to engage farmers that you work with. And we hope that as this tool continues to be kind of used and disseminated and spread, that we can continue to improve it and make it an even better resource for all of you. I'm looking, I've got a quick question. Oh, can the slides be sent out to the attendees or via an email? Yes, I think we can do that. So thank you. So thanks again for your time. Please do follow up with us, with any of the three of us that were on today if you have any questions. And we will definitely follow up with some of these resources directly as well as posting them online. Thanks.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.